Now, do you have a counter there that you can look at while this show is on and yeah, and see what kind of actual numbers that we're getting? And if we can't make a screenshot, at least take a picture or just try to copy the number down so that we know we have like an accurate figure of what's the highest number. Yeah, it's not going to work every time. This we know, but that's okay. That's okay as long as we're keeping an eye on it. Also, I wanted to ask you about something else. When I was away, I was watching one of Jerry's shows, and she had a guest on who was an old singer from the casinos or something like that, and he was really something special. He was great. But she had him in the corner of the screen on Skype. I want to do that. How do I do that? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. So while they're on Skype, I could actually receive phone calls. Oh, we have got to do that. We totally have to do that. Yes. Okay. That's good preparation for, what will surely go wrong once or twice, right? Because if we know Skype, that's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. In a minute. Yeah. Okay. Hit the music. Yeah. And it's 8 o'clock on Thursday night, and that can only mean one thing. It's time for the 31st installment of the Age Out Angels Radio Hour. My name is Greg Rapport. I am the founder and executive director of Age Out Angels. We are a 501c3 nonprofit corporation that provides one-to-one mentors to youth who are in need. This program is brought to you every week at this same time, courtesy of Doc G and the fine people here at Hamilton Radio, who allow us to use this airtime. Doc G is on the big board tonight, along with Robin, who is back there. We're back live after 3 weeks of pre-recorded shows, and it's so good to be back. I'm going to try not to scream into the microphone, but it's great to be back. It's great to see Doc G again, and just to be back here in the studio, where we feel so comfortable. We did a kind of experiment, which I feel went rather well. I was so pleased after the first pre-recorded show aired on March 8th with Zoe Brooks from the Trenton Circus Squad. We had over 38,000 listeners. 38,000 listeners, I think that's more than I expected, first of all, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. It certainly exceeded my expectations and shows that people are beginning to share the show on Facebook. And we're making some headway towards creating awareness of the state of child welfare in this country and, hopefully ways that it can be improved, because that's what we're all about. No call-ins tonight. We need to keep the line open for our special guest, and her name is Sarah Mendeville. She's a pediatric therapist in an inpatient psych facility, and author also of the novel called Sam's Theory. And hopefully, in about 10 or 15 minutes, she'll be calling in from Seattle, Washington. So you can't call in tonight, but you can put comments on my Facebook page. I see Tony's already out there. So you can write comments or questions on my Facebook page. Erin's there. Erin is actually happy. She's going to be hearing from our guest tonight. So that's wonderful, Erin. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. And so Sarah Mendeville will be with us in just a little while. I got an interesting email from One Simple Wish this week that stated the average number of days a child spends in foster care in the United States is 730. So if it's continuous, you know, that's like 2 solid years of time. But here, what I want you to know and what I want you to remember is the youth who have happy, well-adjusted foster or kinship care experiences are not the ones we see. The ones who are in foster care for, like, you know, a few months and then are reunited with their families, and their families solve whatever issues and challenges that they had before the children went into foster care, and the children grow up to be happy and well-adjusted. These are not the children that we see. But see, what's important is to remember that the children who do grow up well-adjusted actually do exist. The news is not all bad, but in reality world, the people that we see, the ones who Age Out Angels was designed to help, are the ones who really need someone to be in their corner and make them feel worthwhile. They don't have anyone. The people we work with don't yet know that they can be successful contributors to society. They just don't know that yet. They need help to get there, but they have all the potential, and we never give up on a child. So with that in mind, please tell your friends to tune into this program right now and help us spread the word. And you do that by hitting that share button on Facebook, or send a mass email to your address book. And please tell your friends to share this with their friends. It's really that simple for you to do your part and help us spread the word. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned an organization called One Simple Wish. And I want you to remember that name because we're so grateful to them for their help. We've been working with a young lady for over a year now who was basically couch surfing or sleeping in her car. And when we first met her, and, you know, we sort of helped her get shelter and food, but her dream was always to go to college. And the thing is, for her, it wasn't unattainable. She had the smarts. She has, like, innate ability. And she could be very, very successful at higher education. So long story short, she got into the school she wanted in New York City, but couldn't afford the $400 a month for a rail pass to get back and forth from New Jersey to New York, okay? So Age Out Angels was able to raise $1,000, which helped with some of her registration costs and got her about 5 weeks of a rail pass. One Simple Wish just stepped up and found a donor who was willing to pay $400 for another month to keep her going. And we are so grateful to them for doing that. And if anyone wants to write to me, you know, in my Facebook page and tell me they might be able to cover all or part of the $400 that she's going to need in the month of May, well, I would love to hear from you tonight. If we could get that covered tonight before the show is over, that would be a home run. And if you have the bandwidth and a few extra dollars, go to onesimplewish.org and give them a few dollars, because as you can see, it doesn't always necessarily matter if you give the money to Age Out Angels or One Simple Wish. We all try to work together. So whether you give it to them or to us, that money goes round and round on a big carousel, and it finds the spot where it can be used to benefit children the most. And that's where that money exits. And you can feel good about that. So you see how it works? Once again, we just need your help to spread the word. The success of a program like this is wholly dependent on people like you caring enough to want to share its value via social media and to all your friends, by email. And now, if you think of the reasons that people use social media, you know, to show pictures of their casseroles, and there are always good pictures. I love the casseroles. I want to jump in and eat them. Of course, I can't. um, or people talk about their political opinions, or one of my favorite purposes for social media, which is to stay connected with my old friends from 8th grade. If we work together, we can use social media to improve the lives of children, and it actually requires very little effort on your part. So please consider yourselves all deputies in the Child Welfare Army of Age Out Angels. Remember, over 400,000 youth in the foster care system, 20,000 age out every year. Plus, there are another 3 million youth who are homeless, and even more who live in poverty. It's a big job, and we can't do it without your help spreading the word. I want you guys to know in the booth there, I'm hearing something else coming through my headset right now. Sounds like another song or maybe another broadcast. It's possible that one of the other channels on the station is bleeding into my headset. And so anyway, while you are sharing this broadcast on Facebook with all your friends, I'd like to remind everyone that our theme music comes to us as courtesy from Kurt Seldemridge, operator of the Cave Rehearsal Recording Space in Pennsylvania. If you have recording or rehearsal needs, you can get in touch with Kurt by emailing to thecave1876@gmail.com. Again, that's thecave1876@gmail.com. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Marty Light, who graciously donated his time to play sweet bass guitar on the track. So once again, feel free to write your questions and comments in my Facebook page, and I'll try to answer them as we go. And you can feel free to tell me your thoughts on any of the subjects we discussed tonight. And tonight, the theme of our show is all about trauma. I hope it's not a traumatic experience for all of you, but that is something that we all experience from time to time. But when children are abused or neglected, or frequently both, the notion of trauma takes on a whole new face. And so, like, just let me give you a quick example to put this in a framed context for everyone. When you're learning how to ride a bike, you fall and skin your knee. That can be traumatic. We would refer to that as being traumatic. But what we're talking about here, and what affects the behavior of a lot of the people that we work with, is really referred to as complex trauma, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So what we're looking at here is, sort of the difference between something that, might happen to you suddenly. You get hurt, you break your arm, whatever, you break a bone. And that is certainly traumatic. But complex trauma, and especially complex trauma in children, is really kind of a traumatic event on a whole different scale. So I just want to tell you first, there's a diagnostic definition of trauma. And the diagnostic definition is that trauma is exposure to death, actual or threatened, or threatened sexual violation through experiencing the events yourself, witnessing the events in person as they occurred to others, the events occurred to a close relative or friend, the incident must have been violent or accidental, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the event. And the example that they give is like, first responders who were collecting body parts at the World Trade Center. Every single time they turned around, every scoop of a shovel, produced more and more reminders of horror and gore. That's the kind of trauma that we're talking about. Now, we refine this a step further to describe trauma in children under 6. Again, it's exposure to death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violation by experiencing the events yourself, witnessing the events in person as they occur to others, or learning it occurred to a parent or caregiver. And that's one of the ones that's really different compared to the diagnostic rules for adults. When a child learns that something traumatic, and we're talking about exposure to death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violation, when they learn that happens to a parent or caregiver, that's part of their support structure that falls apart. And that's the kind of trauma that we're talking about. It becomes complex trauma when the trauma occurs multiple times with no healing. And the point here is that multiple traumatic events are way worse than the impact of a single event. And the thing is, people never get used to trauma. You don't get used to it. You will see people go like sort of stone cold faced, and that's called a flattening of their affect. So what I want you to understand is that a flattening of affect or non-responsiveness does not mean that the person is getting used to the trauma. Like if you just get used to it, or if you could just get over it, you know, these sort of simple cliche type sentences that people will offer, you know, as though they're helping. So, you know, what is healing? Well, when you're talking about a child, and that's what we talk about here is child welfare. Parents, caretakers, or professionals usually help children overcome non-abuse acute trauma. You know, and the way they do that is first of all, they believe and validate the child's experience. And if you're a parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about now. In fact, when the child falls off the bike and skins his knee, you say, "Oh, that bad bicycle," right? And then you tolerate the child's affect, which means if the kid is sitting there screaming and crying, that's okay, you know, for a minute or two. You let them cry. They'll cry it out. This is sort of the normal way most of us were treated and the way we treat our children. And then, of course, while we're validating the child's experience and tolerating their reaction to their own pain, we are managing our own emotional reactions. Child fell off the bicycle, skinned his knee. We don't have a heart attack over it. We just remain calm and show the child what calm looks like. Now, the problem happens when it's actually the parents or caregivers who are the sources of the trauma or who are traumatized themselves to the point where they cannot perform those functions. And I believe we have a caller on the line. Sarah, is that you?
This is. Hi, how are you?
Hi, it's great to hear from you, Sarah. Thanks for calling in. I was just telling the good people about trauma.
Ah.
And so what a timely phone call. Let me introduce you properly.
Okay.
Sarah Mendenhall is our guest tonight, and Sarah is a master's level pediatric therapist on an inpatient psychiatric unit. Sarah has worked with hundreds of children and teens burdened by trauma. She was the founder and editor-in-chief of Light Spinner Quarterly, a publication that advocated for children exposed to medical trauma. And her story, 150 real-life stories of resilience, joy, and hope, was published in Reader's Digest. So all these different roles that she plays in this industry offer her the opportunity to advocate for child by speaking nationally at conferences, colleges, and in the media like right here. So Sarah, sorry that was the longest introduction in the world, but you've done a lot of things, and I just want to say hi and welcome you to the Age Out Angels Radio Hour.
Thank you. That was probably one of the grandest entrances I've had. I appreciate that.
Well, I can't see you, but I hope you twirled. Now, so does a young lady grow up wanting a career as a child psychologist? When did that hit you?
You know, that's a great question. I actually knew at 12 years old. I knew pretty early on. I was standing in the line with my friend listening, and we were in junior high, and she was talking about some boy she had a crush on that broke her heart, and she stopped in the middle of her sentence. She said, "You know, Sarah, you're a really good listener." And I said, "Thanks." And she's like, "You know, I think you would be a really good seismologist." And I was like, "What is that?" And she said, "Somebody that gets paid to listen." I was like, "Wow, okay." I ran to the library, and I said, "I need all the books that you have on seismology." And so the librarian brought back a bunch of books on earthquakes. And I said, "What is this?" And he's like, "Well, what are you looking for?" And I said, "Well, you know, it's a job where you listen to people." And he's like, "Oh, that's psychology." And so when he brought back the books, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is it." And I started flipping through, and it was love at first sight. So I knew pretty early on.
I should tell you that I did spend some time in seismology myself. There was very little listening involved in that. Boy, 12 years old. I think that's just remarkable to know what you want to do. And so that you set your sights on that, huh? Like going through high school.
I did. Psychology is always just, what's turned me on and gotten me excited, and it's the only thing that I've woken up every day wanting to do. And I remember a professor when I was younger told me that his definition of success was looking at what you want to do and what you have to do and realizing they're the same thing. And psychology has always been that for me.
And was it always about children?
Yes, it's always been kids. I don't know why. I grew up babysitting, and I've always had an affinity for the little ones. And when I started my college courses finally in abnormal psych and different things, it just clicked with me. Kids made sense to me. And I think culturally and historically they've been underrepresented and undervalued. And so I felt that I had purpose in giving them a voice long term in whatever I was going to end up doing.
Absolutely. We were just talking the other day about how the old way was children should be seen and not heard, right?
Absolutely,
And so talk about being underrepresented, So you actually began an internship while you were still in college, right? You hadn't even graduated, and you were cutting your teeth in the real world.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
And so that was really your first experience in a psych residential facility?
It was, yeah. It was a pretty big experience for me. There were a lot of what I call learn and burns.
Yes. Were you a lamb? Were you a lamb in the
I was, yeah. I was fresh off, and yeah, it was a little overwhelming. But still, it got me excited because I knew there was a lot to learn. I needed something bigger than me that did scare me, so it would cause me to grow, and that's what did it for me.
So what were the rookie mistakes or things you learned when you were doing that first thing? Were there any traumatic experiences?
Oh, probably too many to list. I know something small. I remembered a kiddo that I had loved playing with. He asked, we had played like Uno for a couple hours, and he asked, can you come back tomorrow? And I said, oh yeah, sure, I'll be by, no problem. And then I didn't realize until that night that I had class, and I wasn't able to come back. And I felt devastated. I was devastated that I had promised a kiddo in the hospital that would come back and play with him, and I had no way of communicating, like getting a hold of him. So I wasn't able to come back until 2 days later and sort of had a repair talk with him. But I learned right then and there, and I've said ever since, no promises in the hospital. And I think it's a pretty good mantra to apply to anything, really. If you know that you can't honor sort of what you're putting forth with a kiddo or really with anybody, then you need to think twice about offering that as a promise. Yeah,
that's probably true with adults too in that kind of a situation. I mean, he could have sat waiting for you for 8-10 hours,
Yeah, and I'd say one of the biggest ones though is I remember working with a kiddo, and I was brand new. It was my first week there, and so really my only job, because they didn't want me to mess up on anything, was to play like different shark games and card games with a 5 or 6 year old that was in bed, and he was on the inpatient medical floor. And so I played with him every day for a couple hours, and we got pretty close by the end of the week, and we would make jet noises together and car noises, and we just sort of had our routine. And I remember going in the next week, and before I walked into his room, a nurse told me, she said, he's just not feeling good today. I don't think it's a good time for him to play. And it surprised me. And I said, oh, well, what's going on with him? She said, well, he has a low blood count. I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, he has cancer. And when your blood count gets low, kiddos get sick, and they can potentially die from any kind of common cold or anything. And it hit me all at once, and I looked up and I read the sign, and I had been working on the HEMOC floor the entire time, which means, hematology and oncology, and it didn't occur to me ever in the week that I had been playing with this kid, oh, he has cancer. I just saw the kid, and
Sure.
I was devastated. I remember calling my mom and saying, I can't do this. There's no way I can work with kids that are dying or that have this kind of trauma. I just can't do it. And she said, you know what, sweetie, it's not your job to heal these kids or to bring them back from whatever diseases. It's just your job to love them in the short time that you're there, and that is all. And I took that with me, and that helped me ultimately build my cushion for the rest of my professional career.
It sounds like you took something else with you as well, if I may make an observation here, because
Sure.
there's an element that peppers the work that you do, even today. At least that's the impression that I have. There's an element of creativity that goes in with what you do. You're always trying to look for a way to reach through to a young person, using whatever creative means you have to in order to engage them. And what you just said, that they didn't want you to mess up, so you were sent to basically play. It sounds like that playfulness is still very much a part of your routine, and I wonder if those seeds were planted, way back then when you were just starting doing that internship and couldn't be trusted with anything more. So did you?
Absolutely.
So what about the street smart kids? How savvy were you when you started your first job?
I was not. Part of that was I did a rotation in a residential treatment home, and I was working with some girls only a few years younger than me, actually, because I started that internship about 19, 20 years old, and these kiddos went up to 17. And I remember they worked me over pretty good. They would ask for something, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's against the rules, but the way they would sort of manipulate the conversation, and I knew it was happening, but I just wasn't quick enough to keep up with it and sort of have that dialogue back with them. And I realized they just had way more street smarts than I did. They were edgier than I was, and I realized I had to catch up and polish up on some of my skills, interpersonally and otherwise, just to be able to do that. And I appreciated that challenge, but that was a lot of work, and that was very surprising at first.
Yeah, I can imagine. You know where I see that all the time, when we find kids who are LGBTQ+, and they come from middle class homes, but when they come out, they get kicked out, right? And so all of a sudden they go from middle or maybe even upper middle class or better socioeconomic group, and now they're on the streets, and they make every mistake. When it comes to their interpersonal relations with people. They make every single mistake, and it certainly is a tough lesson to learn. To sort of exist in that environment. So all right, so when someone comes to your facility, now this is a short-term facility, right? It's sort of like 3 to 7 days. Is that what?
Yeah, it's about 3 to 7 days, and it's acute care. So we are just stabilizing them enough to make sure that they're in a place where they feel healthy enough to return back into the outside world, and set them up with care for outpatient.
Right. So the point that I want to make sure everyone understands here is that there's sort of a line, and when people cross that line behaviorally, they get taken to a facility like yours, correct?
That's correct.
And they're either brought in by a parent or a caregiver or someone from the school or law enforcement, right? So how do people ever, are people ever brought into your facility in restraints?
Yes, we've had that.
But it's not common. It sounds like it's not common.
It's not, I think it depends on what's going on, but every kiddo that shows up is assumed to be having a very difficult time.
Yeah.
They have just been in an environment, in a world that is not supportive, and that has treated them in a way where they've had to, act out in a certain way to get their needs met. And so some of them come in with tempers and need help managing that. But I will say, when kiddos come in and they are restrained, they don't leave that way. So I've never seen a kid come to the unit that hasn't left changed, with a little bit more pep in their step, because of the hope and the coping tools we've provided. So that's sort of the rewarding piece of it.
I love the way your point of view works. That they were in an environment that wasn't conducive to their needs. And when you're looking at it that way, then right from the start, you're looking at it from the point of view of the young person. So are there any commonalities among the population that you serve? Can you put them into groups, or is everyone truly a total and complete individual in their behavior and their needs?
I will say this experience has taught me that, or these experiences working with these kiddos for as long as I have, has made me realize that the way we react to scary things that happen to us or hurtful things that happen to us, we might all react in an individual way that meets our temperaments, right? So it's called externalizing. So if we're more outgoing, then we would probably hit a wall when we're really upset. But if you're an internalizer, then that means you just sort of hold on to things, and you might just fall into a depression instead. And even though those are visible differences, at the end of the day, we all experience the human experience in the same way. And that is how and many professionals click in with these kiddos, is that they're able to see, well, listen, hurt is hurt and heartache is heartache. And one of the most common ways, if not the most effective, to mend all of that is just compassion and patience, and meeting that kid at eye level to give them what they need or what they missed out on. And
I'm assuming that you actually sort of what you're seeing in many, many ways, no matter how the behavior manifests, that what you're seeing is a result of some form of trauma.
Yes, most of the time. Yeah, it absolutely is environmental.
So what are a couple of things that trauma is creating in these young people?
Yeah. So trauma is a tricky beast in that it affects every single system that we have. So it will affect the brain both physiologically and mentally. So trauma, when something scary happens, and it happens over and over again, or something like neglect happens, it can physically alter the brain. And so it was recently found at a trauma lab that I worked at the University of Washington. There's a study done where they did MRIs of kiddos that had been exposed to these kinds of scary experiences, and they found that the white cortical matter, and that's the very outer part of the brain, had thinned over time after lots of exposure to these experiences, and that created really hyper behavior in the kids as they grew older. And so what we're seeing is a lot of people, ADHD is very popular right now. We're talking about it a lot. We're diagnosing it a lot. We're medicating it a ton. And really what we're finding is quite a bit, especially on the unit, it's so apparent and concentrated, is that all of these behavioral issues are actually trauma responses. The brain is just trying to figure out how to feel safe again and be stimulated in a way that it wasn't able to before. And trauma also affects kiddos long term. There's something called the vagal nerve that goes from the brain to the rest of the body that's responsible for basics like breathing and blood regulation. And trauma long term can cause that vagal nerve to create a domino effect, and it causes asthma or polycystic ovarian syndrome. Trauma affects us, even on a societal level, where it's been found that most kiddos that experience trauma grow into adults that can't hold jobs in a way that other maybe neurotypical adults can, and then they don't buy houses, and it affects the economy. So it affects a lot of it. And so those. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that really sort of shocked me when I started to learn about this myself, because you're talking about the physiological part of this. I saw some pictures of people that you were just describing that had been exposed to complex trauma, and they demonstrated that the cerebral cortex was actually smaller in those children, and that affects cognition. And
yes,
so why isn't this child doing well in school? Like it's not such an overt behavior thing, right? But it's just, you have a kid who's trying to keep up in school, but their cognition is impaired,
yes.
And it comes as a result of the trauma. Um, do you also find a possible relationship between the onset of certain psychosis and the time in a person's life when that comes on?
Yes, absolutely. I think, there are genetic predispositions for everything. But what we're finding through epigenetics is that when a kiddo is in a stressful environment and they might have a gene for schizophrenia or something of the like, then if they're in that kind of scary environment or stress is happening constantly, then it can turn that gene on and the kiddo will start presenting the symptoms early on. And that's why it's so important to start thinking about environments and how we're interacting with kids, and also even trauma-informed care and trauma-informed schools, which is Harvard is taking part in that quite a bit right now, as educators are finally realizing, oh my gosh, trauma is related to learning disabilities and different things like that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you know what? I just want to pause for 1 second and speak directly to our listeners, because right now, as we're talking about trauma in children, everyone is seeing a different image of a child in their own mind. And what I'll bet money, is that no one is seeing an image of an infant. And I just wanted to make the point here that the ages of 0 to 3 are many, many times where the seeds of this complex trauma are planted, and bad things begin to happen physiologically and mentally.
Yes.
So it's not like, one day there's a 9 or 10-year-old who's being neglected. There's a really good chance that person was being neglected when he was 6 months old or 8 months old, and that's really when that starts. Now, I'm getting a question come in. Is there a relationship between in utero trauma and brain change?
Absolutely. So actually, the central nervous system is the first thing to develop. So within 22 days, a kiddo is developing that in utero. And if the mom is experiencing trauma either through domestic violence or homelessness or, a stress where she's constantly turned on in that way, she releases cortisol and is flushing all of that into that embryo. And so that's why it's so careful to have that time period as a precious caretaking time period, because it matters as early as conception and in utero.
That's just remarkable that happens in that way, and I'm glad we were able to point that out. Now, I also want to tell our listeners that we're going to take a break in just a minute and give everyone a chance to share this on Facebook. So, Doc G, if you would cue up the music and give us a minute. But before we do that, I want to say hi to Danielle, who's out there. Vivian is out there. Lisa is out there. I want to thank you all very much, not only for listening, but for writing in and for that great question about in utero trauma. That's what we need, is more folks like that out there listening. So let's take a break. While we're taking a break, please hit that share button on your Facebook page and tell your friends to share it with their friends as well. Okay, back in a minute with our guest. We're back. Sarah, I hope you're still there.
I am, thanks.
Okay. I'm glad. I always worry when the music goes on that I'm going to lose you. Before we continue, I just need to take one moment and remind everyone about the Princeton Oaks Charitable Trust. The Princeton Oaks Charitable Trust provides funds for worthy individuals, organizations, and veterans. If you think you have a worthy cause, you should call the president of the trust to find out if you qualify. His name is Stuart Malakov, and his phone number is 609-933-7085. Do that right away. And, of course, I said that too fast for you to write it down, so if you hit me up on Facebook, I'll be happy to give it to you, okay? And I also need to take just a second and the people who have made donations to Age Out Angels this week. Special thanks to our big donors, Jeff and Lisa Filer, to the Educational Testing Service, and to One Simple Wish once again for their contribution to help our young lady get transportation to college from New Jersey to New York. And remember, everyone, every time you purchase something from Amazon.com, you could be making a donation to Age Out Angels without spending a penny more. You heard me right. It doesn't cost you one penny. You know, when you go to Amazon, there's a pop-up that offers you a chance to go to Amazon Smile. Well, if you make your purchase through Amazon Smile, you can designate Age Out Angels as your donation organization. And without it costing you one penny more, a portion of your purchase will go to help children who need it the most. And if you want to friend me on Facebook, I can send you a link that will take you directly to our designation on Amazon Smile, save you a whole bunch of clicks and wading through a bunch of other organizations. But please do that, because right now, Amazon is promising us triple of their regular payout on this. So if you're buying a lot of stuff for, I don't know, the holidays that are coming up, and you're getting it through Amazon, please, please, please designate Age Out Angels as your Amazon Smile designation. Back to our guest, Sarah Mendeville. Sarah, have you ever felt physically threatened?
Yes, there's been instances where, the feelings get bigger than the kids, and, they're having a hard time. Yes.
And so what happens in that situation?
Usually, because the kiddos come in such an acute manner, it's a crisis stabilization unit. We just assume that there might be a risk for violence, and a lot of it, and we're trained to restrain, but ultimately we have a philosophy where we just would rather not. We would rather teach skills to kiddos that haven't had an opportunity to learn them, to manage their own feelings and create a safe environment, also something that they haven't had before. And so a lot of it is meeting that heightened situation with calm, and sort of being the center of the tornado is what I like to call it, because what happens is if everything gets really, really big, and a kid things just get way bigger than what they can handle. My job is to be a calm presence and to show them otherwise, and just to wait and be patient and compassionate and make sure that it's safe for them, and then just wait till they return, and then to let them know that they're still accepted even after those hard feelings have happened.
Oh, and so now we're talking about the craft of what you do on a professional level. What you just described is like a reshaping, a reframing of the environment that the child is in. But you did tell me, so tell the listeners what you told me about, what was it, your last shift in Chicago?
Yes, we had one gentleman that was having a hard time, and he was on, his diagnosis was he was on the spectrum, and so he had a hard time verbalizing his needs, and so a lot of what he would do was physical, and I in an interaction with him, I got bit, and we figured that out after. But I ended up, when I moved from Chicago to Seattle and I drove cross country, I was telling Greg that I drove across country with a bruise on my arm for a couple of weeks, and that was sort of I like to call it, just sort of a token of what I did, a reminder of all the great stuff that I did in Chicago that I was leaving behind.
Yeah, you brought a little badge of honor with you across country.
It was, yeah. I earned it, and I loved it.
I also have to tell our listeners who are in the East Coast, or maybe not in Seattle, it's the vernacular that you use, the way you use the word kiddos. We would, that's not in our speech at all. We use the word youth, and that's it.
Yes.
And that's and I just want to make sure our listeners understand that you sort of use that as a term of endearment, and it's the nomenclature of Seattle, I guess, the area that you live. Or did you use that same in Chicago when you were in Illinois?
We used it in Chicago. We used it. It is a term of endearment. When I talk to a kid directly, if it's a boy or a boy that identifies as a boy, I call him sir. Actually, I don't care if he's 3 years old or 16. When he talks to me, I address him as sir, and the same goes for girls. I say yes, ma'am, and I heard you, because they will know immediately that I or whoever's working with them respects them, and respect and reliability comes before change. You have to know that the adult working with you actually sees you and is respecting you, so that you feel that you could be in a place to maybe even share a little bit of yourself with them. Otherwise, what's the point? And so kiddo, after a while of that sort of formal social grace, then it turns to kiddo, and it's just it's youth, and I do use the fancier terms in the field, but I think kiddo is just a way that I show that I'm locked in and I'm caring about you, and it's just kind of a personal word.
Absolutely. And I have to tell everyone, Tony is listening in. Tony, it's good to have you here. Danielle is listening in tonight, and Erin gave me the little love emoji on Facebook. So Erin, I love you too. Thank you very much for listening to the show tonight. So what is it, Sarah? Is it nature or nurture? Is it environment or is it genetics? What is causing this?
I'm leaning towards environment. It's a whole lot of environment. So even if you have a disposition for something, you can make amends with it as regards to like the interventions that you use, even medically, right? If we have asthma, right, we can use inhalers. But if you're running constantly or doing other things, it's going to aggravate it. It's the same with mental health. These kids, adults are role models, right? And that is we have things in our brains called mirror neurons, right? So we are wired to act like others act and learn their behaviors, and that's where a lot of children learn from the adults that they're around or from other children that they're around. And so the reality is, a lot of people, they're looking for, well, what is causing all this? I don't know where this behavior came from. And sometimes it's a matter of taking a hard look at yourself and what you're doing, in their life, and not in a blaming way, but as a learning and a teaching point, and a self-awareness point of, this kiddo's temperament or however they're built just might not mix with yours. And so what is a way that you can come together and start doing that? It's heavy environment.
Absolutely. And it's funny. I was just at a lecture the other day where they were talking about how, there are some cultures where when someone, does something that's considered to be antisocial, they convene a hearing. But the purpose of the hearing is not to decide on the appropriate punishment. The purpose of the hearing is to decide what went wrong with the society that caused that behavior to happen. And, I thought that was kind of an interesting way to approach it. Now, let's talk a little bit about Sam's theory. But before we do that, I want to make it absolutely clear from the introduction that I gave you tonight, which I thought was stunning. That this is not the first time you've been published.
No, it is. No, I had my own magazine for several years, and it was an advocacy piece for hospitalized kiddos, mostly medical trauma. And then I had a short story published, but I wasn't serious about writing until the last couple of years when I finally dedicated myself to a novel.
What was in Reader's Digest? The 150 real-life stories of resilience, joy, and hope. What was that?
Yeah, I am huge on those things. Hope and resilience are my buzzwords. And so it was a short piece about two friends that were separated by distance, and one missing the snow in Chicago, and so she created confetti for her to make it snow one day to make her feel better. So it's just a supportive piece.
Oh, that's sweet. So now basically your entire life is leading up to Sam's theory.
Yes.
Okay. And so what made you say I have to write this now?
It was on the unit when I was working with these kids, and one night the universe sort of brought together this group of kiddos that were living in residential treatment centers, and they all had similar histories. And I remember sitting and feeling frustrated that they didn't have more immediate access to help. And I thought, one thing I used to tell the kids when they arrived on the unit, I would say, hi, how you doing? I'm Sarah. And I said, there's no book out there, or there's no class that you take in high school that tells you how to deal with trauma when it happens or what feelings to have, right? We're just out there doing the very best that we can with what we have. Eventually I got tired of saying that and realized, why isn't there a book? I don't know why there isn't. And so I wrote one for teenagers, and it holds its own as a young adult novel, but it also has built-in therapeutic advice, which is why it's different. And I wrote it with the intention of getting it to kiddos that don't have that kind of support system.
Who's Sam? It's a gender-neutral name.
It is. She is a 15-year-old girl that runs away from an abusive situation and goes on a healing journey ultimately, and then uses those tools that she learned and then shares them with a peer group, a bunch of other kids that ran away from foster care to empower them as well.
Are a lot of the children that you see coming from foster care?
You would be surprised. They come from all over. We do have quite a bit, but I'd say, yeah, the ratio is pretty evened out. They come from all walks of life.
I mean, you think the most amount of abuse and neglect would be from kids who are in the system, because actually that's how it's defined. But of course, I think we're all more understanding of the realism that this really is stuff that happens in a lot more places than get recognized by the state, and so kids kind of end up in that situation. Now, is Sam someone that you worked with? Is Sam you?
Sam is a blend of different people, but yeah, Sam is a little biographical, as is Theory.
Aha! Now we're getting somewhere. And how do
you caught me.
And how do you feel about that? No, I'm kidding.
Oh,
no,
yeah.
no, don't.
I'm a pretty big believer in I don't ask kids to do things that I wouldn't do, as far as healing or risking some element towards their healing. Yeah. And so I think if I was going to ask them to kind of look at their experiences, to be brave enough to do that and to start reframing those and figuring out what that means for them, then I would have to go first. And that is why Sam and Theory start the story, and then why the kids are introduced later on in the book.
Right. So now let's talk a little bit about the story, and I'm going to count on you to stop me so we don't give too much of it away, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so now Sam is in an abusive home situation. Is she with two parents, one parent? How's that working?
It started with two, and then one left, and then she got taken away by the state and became a ward of the state. Okay,
and was she taken away because the one who remained, which I assume was her mother,
actually,
it was her father?
Yeah, it was her father, and so she was taken away because of his behavior, and then ended up in a residential home.
I see. I do know several kids who are in that situation. Where the mother, I think in a couple of the situations, it was the mother who had the drug problem, and ended up passing away. Child is with the father. I know one in particular where the father, when the child is about 14 years old, just puts her on a corner and says, "Okay, this is where we part company," and leaves her there to be homeless for 2 or 3 years until she was lucky enough to find a family. So that's wow. Certainly, the story. And it happens all the time. So Sam is in that situation and she runs away?
She does run away, because her abuser ends up finding her at the treatment center, and she just doesn't trust that she can be safe anymore. So she ends up running away into the Olympic Mountains, which are here in Washington.
Okay. All right. Now, if people want to purchase this book, how would they go about doing that?
Well, funny you mention it, because I heard you talking about Amazon earlier. They can buy it on Amazon, either through Kindle or on print, but it's also available on Barnes & Noble, if that's more helpful.
Okay. So you could go to Amazon and designate Age Out Angels as your Amazon Smile organization, yes?
Yep.
And then you could buy Sam's Theory. Just do a search on Sam's Theory, right?
Yep, that works out.
That's how it goes. Sarah, I want to tell you, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. you have this element of creativity and playfulness that is so refreshing.
Thank you.
And boy, I'm sure when you bring that to people who feel bad, I'll bet they feel good instantly.
Oh yeah, I make sure of it.
Yeah, yeah. So please, keep up doing the wonderful work, and I'll talk to you real soon. Thank you so much for calling in tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg, and everybody else. Take care.
It's a pleasure. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Sarah Mendeville. You can go to Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble and buy her book, Sam's Theory. Very knowledgeable person. She understands her craft. And I have tremendous respect for people who take their craft seriously in that way, especially when it comes to child welfare. Now, I just did want to tell you a few more things before we close out this installment of the Age Out Angels Radio Hour, because we were gone for 3 weeks. And there are actually some pretty cool things that are happening across the country. The Ann E. Casey Foundation, and you've heard me talk about the Casey Foundation a lot on this program. They are the mothership for organizations like Age Out Angels. They've chosen Liberty City in Miami and South City in Memphis as the newest communities to implement what they call as a program called Evidence to Success. Everybody's looking for evidence-based reasons to acquire funding to work specific programs. And this is a framework that combines public health and prevention science to help children and youth meet critical behavioral, education, emotional, and physical milestones. And these two cities, Liberty City in Miami and South City in Memphis, join Providence, Rhode Island, Mobile and Selma, Alabama, and Kearns Township in Salt Lake County, Utah, which are already carrying out that framework. Evidence to Success helps public system leaders and community residents work together to gather data on the needs and strengths of local youth. Use the data to set priority areas to improve well-being for young people and shift public funding to address those needs with proven programs. The Casey Foundation is a wonderful organization, and while you're reaching into your wallet to give money to the rest of us, give a few dollars to them. And very interesting gentleman by the name of Xavier Mountain. He is a graduate of the foster system, and he wrote a story in the Sacramento Bee in California. This is just 2 days ago, stating that millions of dollars in college aid is being left behind by California's foster kids. So the money is out there, and this is why Age Out Angels exists. This is the exact reason, so that children who don't know how to access the money and things that they are entitled to get presented to them and worked out, and they can access those things. So millions of dollars in college aid is being left behind by California's foster kids, and too few are going to college. Financial aid deadlines and eligibility standards don't take into account the needs of foster youth. And in fact, foster youth are rarely unable to go directly from high school to college. Doesn't work that way. They have to figure out, they have to work, they have to figure out a way to make money, they have to figure out a residence. There's stuff that they have to do, and apparently this money was only good if you went directly. They're unable to do that. So that's a big reason why 9% of eligible foster youths receive what's called a Cal Grant, which is the state's largest financial aid program. Though more than 90% of foster youths express a desire to go to college, just 4% ultimately earn a bachelor's degree. And compare that 4% to the 36% of young adults in their age group who are not in foster care who end up with a bachelor's degree. So, I mean, that disparity there is really, really striking. And there's a new outreach program and a bill. It's called the California Foster Youth FAFSA Challenge. It's an initiative by John Burton Advocates for Youth, and it helps schools reach high school seniors who are foster youths. Its goal is to bring the percentage of foster youths who complete the federal financial aid form, that's the FAFSA, at least equal to the overall percentage of high school seniors who aren't in foster care. It's Senate Bill 940, introduced by Senator Jim Beal, a San Jose Democrat, would extend the Cal Grant application deadline for foster youths who want to attend community college. which community colleges where 85% of foster kids start their post-secondary education. It would also lengthen the Cal Grant eligibility. This is huge, from 4 years to 8 years, and from 1 year after high school graduation all the way to age 26. That is absolutely gigantic. And I guess we're going to have to keep an eye on this and keep our fingers crossed and hope that gets passed in the California legislature. Another story comes to us from Northampton, Massachusetts. It's reported in the Daily Hampshire Gazette. And I love this story. This is about an organization called Friends of Children. They're launching a pilot program called Focus, which will connect. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. This program will connect age-outs with families between the without families. Sorry, age-outs without families between the ages of 18 and 24 with volunteers who can mentor and support them. That's exactly what Age Out Angels does, except, of course, we're 14 to 24, but that's okay. That's a minor technicality. This is a mirror image of Age Out Angels. And let me tell you why I'm like doubly excited to learn about programs like this. Because if a youth calls us from that area, then we'll be able to immediately refer them, and they'll have a chance to get a mentor right away instead of us trying to look around for a single individual who can mentor them in that space. So knowing that there's an organization out there, it could prove tremendously beneficial. We may also have a youth who's passing through their area that they might be able to provide some help and assistance for. So that's a small organization, just a teeny little piece, but it's just such a great piece, and I love sharing it. And finally tonight, from the San Antonio Express News. Well, this is a sad story. I'm ending on a sad story tonight. A dozen foster children were named in a 2011 class action lawsuit against the state of Texas that alleges abuse, too many moves, and a lack of caseworker contact in foster care in the state of Texas. The reason this 2011 story is coming out now is because it's expected to be argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, like soon. So this has been going on. So after aging out of foster care, a lot of these kids have been 7 years, disappeared, faced homelessness and unemployment. Some had children of their own, and those children are now in the system. And, you know, as we say here a lot, dire outcomes are common for the roughly 1,300 Texas children who age out of foster care each year without a permanent home, according to experts. There's a quote here: "These kids are going to turn 18 and they have nowhere to go, no skills," said Karen Langsley, a representative for a plaintiff. Where are they going for Christmas? Who's going to call and send them a happy birthday card? Where are they going to find a meal? Where are they going to find a bed? The lawsuit reached a climax in January when a federal judge ordered the state to make sweeping and immediate reforms, including expanding foster home options, making it easier for kids to report abuse, and reducing work caseloads. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Doesn't it sound wonderful? The court did the right thing, right? And what do you think happened? What do you think happened when the court did the right thing? Enter Attorney General Ken Paxton, who swiftly appealed the decision. And this is what he said. This guy makes me so mad. He said the tragic histories of a dozen hand-picked plaintiffs are not representative of the roughly 12,000 Texas children in long-term foster care, most of whom do not experience maltreatment. That's what the state wrote in a filing to the Fifth Circuit this month. That's their argument. Their argument is there aren't enough children suffering to make it worth their while to, I guess, cost a little more money, right, to expand the law in a way that will actually help children. There aren't enough. How many people is enough, Attorney General Ken Paxton? How many kids have to suffer before you say, well, okay, the balance has turned? And I'll tell you something else, too. I'll bet you don't even know. I'll bet you don't know the numbers. I'll bet you have no idea how many children are suffering. And so on that sad note, perhaps we should all send an email to Attorney General Ken Paxton of the state of Texas and remind him that children are people too. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Another hour talking about youth who should matter more in our political and economic discourse than they do. We thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we thank the wonderful people here at Hamilton Radio. And we thank our guest, Sarah Mendeval, who was absolutely spectacular. And I hope Sarah will keep in touch with us. Join me next Thursday at 8 p.m., where we'll have another special surprise guest. And we'll be talking more about issues that affect the child welfare system. So until next week at 8 p.m., let this week be your best week ever. Good night.